So first of all, a brief introduction. My name is Paul Spooner. I'm a naval architect based in the UK. And my career, basically the last 30-odd years now, has been with Classic Yachts. And I've been lucky enough in that time to be involved with a lot of very big restorations, many of which were under the banner of Fairley Restorations in the UK, where I was Chief Naval Architect for 17 years. And then since 2016, working for my own company, Paul Spooner Design, working with classic yacht projects in the UK, Europe, and as far afield as Japan, Thailand, and Indonesia at the moment. So, there we go. The subject of this presentation is the latest refit and restoration of Shamrock V, currently underway in Southampton. So we're going to do a little bit of history of the boat, and then we'll get stuck into the latest stuff. So Shamrock V was launched on the 14th of April 1930 as Sir Thomas Lipton's 5th America's Cup Challenger. Now, we won't dwell too long on the outcome of that challenge, potentially not her greatest moment. In fact, what is her most impressive accolade is that in 94 years since she was launched, she's never actually been out of commission, unlike so many of her sisters. Shamrock V is registered in Lloyd's in 1930 as a centreboard Bermudan sloop built in Gosport by Camper & Nicholson's and designed by Charles Nicholson. She was rated under the universal rule as a J class and was the first J to be built on British soil and the only wooden one. She's now the oldest remaining America's Cup Challenger, as John said. In 1931, Lipton sold Shamrock to the aviation industrialist Sir Thomas Sopwith to help with the development of Endeavour. Shamrock V was then sold to another aviation guru, Sir Richard Fairey, who continued many of the modifications and improvements instigated by Sopwith, including a new aluminium mast, replacing the original spruce one. And he raced her against the big class yachts of the time. She was then sold to an Italian, Mario Crespi, who was the first to fit a comfortable interior, amongst other modifications, famously constructed in maple. And then on to another Italian, Piero Scagnu. When she moved to Italy, she was renamed Quadrifoglio, and in 1967 she returned to Camper & Nicholson's in Southampton for a major 3-year refit. And it's at this point that Shamrock moves into present-day memory, as some of the apprentice shipwrights at Camper & Nicholson's at that time, working on Shamrock, are still with us today, and some of them I've had the great privilege to work with over the last 20 or 30 years. In 1986, she was sold to the Lipton Tea Company and donated to the Museum of Yachting in Rhode Island, and eventually returned to the UK for another major refit at Pendennis in Falmouth in the late 90s, where my own connection with her begins, as Fairley Restorations was engaged to build the deckhouse and skylights, and to assist with laying the deck and other shipwriting work. And interestingly, 2 or 3 of the older guys that were apprenticed in the 60s at Camper & Nicholson were working on Shamrock in that refit. And some of the younger Fairley guys working on that refit and learning from those older guys are now leading the charge on the current refit of Shamrock V. So we've got a pretty much a continuous history of workforce going back 60 years on this boat. And I imagine if you went looking, you could find it pretty much right back to her launch. Fast forward now to 2016. Shamrock has been racing for a few years with the developing fleet of new and restored J's. After a particularly lumpy regatta in the Caribbean, she was found to be taking on significant water through her deck and topsides and was taken by ship back to the UK and lifted out in Saxon Wharf, Southampton, where the problems were investigated, but the repairs never started. She was eventually sold to her current owner in 2021, and we were engaged, along with Fergus Bryan, who some of you may also know, by the owner to manage the project and supply the knowledge, design, and naval architecture to restore her, required to get her back into racing condition. Shamrock V is there racing against Cambria. Shamrock V is not a purist restoration. She's not unchanged from her launch day, like some of the other big classics, such as Mariquita and Lulworth, which were restored from derelict by very purist-thinking owners. And this is largely due to the continued evolution to stay competitive. There are therefore some significant differences between the Shamrock V of today and the original America's Cup Challenger, though they are undoubtedly still the same yacht. Shamrock, the original Challenger, was designed to the original universal rule here, which was an equation relating length, sail area, and displacement. And to rate J, the answer to that equation had to lie somewhere between 65 and 76 feet. However, the Shamrock of today races under a new rule developed by the J-Class Association, to be updated again this year, which is based primarily on performance data derived from computational fluid dynamics, CFD. Each hull is scanned and an inclining carried out to check weight and stability. The results are fed into a computer, and the yachts are tested virtually for a variety of wind angles and wind speeds in a velocity prediction program, VPP. These results are then used to form a rating. And with today's CFD, you could argue that this must create an extremely fair and accurate rating system. However, I should say that it does remove a lot of the restrictions on weight and sail area that were brought about by the original rule with its just 3 variables. Originally, if the displacement went up, the sail area had to come down, and vice versa. That's not the case anymore. Other parts of the rule now state that a full interior must be present, as well as engineering systems, all the engineering systems required in yachts of this size today. And these rules have been used to introduce and keep the system as fair as possible. However, for little Shamrock, who is definitely the baby of the fleet, these requirements have had more of a significant effect. None of the current Js, including Shamrock, would rate anywhere near J under the original rule today. They are all obviously significantly heavier and carrying more sail area, as neither of these elements is penalised in the rating. This is just a table comparing 5 of the current boats, and you can see how well, waterline length's gone up as they got bigger, but huge increases in sail area and displacement for all of them. And with extra weight and larger rigs, the most significant side effect is greater rig loads, exacerbated by modern carbon sails and low stretch running and standing rigging, all factors that the new Js have been designed to withstand. And Valshida and Endeavour cope with very well because of their steel hulls, which are now welded rather than riveted. Over the years, Shamrock has undergone many modifications, most significantly since her 1970s refit at Campers, during which she was replanked in teak from her original mahogany. And the lower part of her steel hull was plated in to form integral tanks. This is an old Campers drawing that we found, where you can see that they plated in and made integral tanks. This work was continued at Pendennis in the late 90s, when the tanks were extended, the lead keel removed, and the entire lower section of the hull was plated in, the ballast then being melted and poured back into the resulting box. Further steelwork was fitted in the form of a replacement stern post, the lower part of the stem, and a stainless steel rudder was fitted in place of the original wooden one. A steel plate sole and bulkheads were fitted around the engine room to create an A60 boundary, as well as the steel watertight bulkheads forward of the saloon, and a lot of strengthening added to the deck to support the new hydraulic winch package and higher rig loads. At the same time, the chain plates were heavily modified for the new rig, having been moved inboard some years previously onto extra steelwork. There you can see the original external channels and the slightly slack rigging on the leeward side there against the current chain plate on the right. So that's enough background and history. Let's jump to 2021. Shamrock is sat in Saxon Wharf with the paint stripped from her topsides and evidence of considerable water ingress manifesting itself in the form of rust pouring through from between the steel frames and the planking. A core team of about 25 or 30 people was assembled from local shipwrights and craftsmen, led by Giles Brotherton, who served his time with Fairley Restorations years ago and has since gone on to lead a lot of other high-profile jobs. We set up under a scaffold, a tented scaffold, without contracting to any particular shipyard. This was to ensure that we had full say over everything that was done and the quality of the workforce, and that the costs were kept under control and spent on the things that really mattered. After close inspection, it was clear that the water was finding its way down through the deck, hitting the steelwork under the deck and running outboard, and then running down between the steelwork and the planking. You can see here the rust pouring out from between the planking and the steelwork behind the linings. So the biggest problem we found was that basically after she'd been through a number of big refits over the years, but the planks had not been removed since they were put on in 1970. She'd been through a couple of big refits, but no one had actually removed the planks in that time. So roll on 6 months, and having chased the rust down the frames, we got to a point where we'd removed every plank and every piece of interior and every piece of engineering in order to give us access to do the work. There you can see the state of the original, largely original steelwork underneath. We had to be really careful at this process to make sure that, at this point, to make sure that we kept the original shape of the boat. So as the planks were removed, we welded on steel angle stringers around the boat, and we took a number of measurements and datums and profile heights and that sort of thing, and marked them all across to the local scaffolding using laser levels, and these were checked off during the whole repair process. Considerable steelwork repairs were then clearly required to the framework and plating. This was overseen by ABS, with whom she's classed. All the frames were tested, and anything with more than 15% loss of thickness was repaired or replaced. And when you're looking at 6 or 7 mil steel, 15% loss is not a great deal. This included considerable lengths of frame flange, large areas of curtain plate and stringer, and all the diagonals. Some steelwork repairs had been carried out over the years, but only by bolting in small sections from the insides without disturbing the planking, which would have led to quite a loss in longitudinal stiffness. At this point, however, it was clear we could see actually how much of the original 1930s structure was there. This is some of the original curtain plate around the boat with the lapped riveted joints in the plate work. That's all still in there now, and the holes in that plate there are for the planking bolts that we reused the same holes. Everything went back in the same place. Here, the bit on the left there is not on board anymore. That's the very front of the steel deck underneath the deck planking. But interesting, you can see there the 2 riveted strips there are the remains of the original forestay chain plate, which has not been used for a long time. And on the right there, the deck collar from the mizzen mast, now buried underneath the owner's cabin deckhead, but where the mizzen mast was dropped in for that first transatlantic delivery for the America's Cup Challenge. The likely reason for the failure in areas of the hull, therefore, can be put down to a heady mix of higher loadings and heavily degraded steelwork and fastenings. And one of the clear priorities of this restoration was to systematically reinstate the hull strength and stiffness to allow her to remain competitive in the current J-class fleet. By this point, it was clear that the project had grown, as always, beyond its original scope and expectation. And as we had all possibilities open to us, and an owner that wanted to cruise with his family as well as race, we considered what could be done to supposedly improve her once again and make her suitable for her new role. These considerations can be split into the following categories. Weight, could we save any weight in the new refit? Performance, always, can we make her perform any better? Strength, was she going to be strong enough for the new rig loads? Accommodation, because, well, every owner has their own ideas of what's required. And engineering, everything needed to be updated. As I mentioned earlier, the yacht is classed under ABS, and the MCA as a commercial vessel for purposes of charter. ABS look after the hull structure, and the MCA set out rules for safety and stability depending on the size of the yacht and its area of operation. Some of you may know that the rules for large yachts have evolved considerably over the last sort of 15 to 20 years to cover the mega yachts of today. And these rules have become quite onerous for classic yachts. However, Shamrock is actually only governed by the small boat code, which is usually for boats under 24 metres, because she's under 150 gross tons, and crucially, her keel was laid before 1968. So, bearing that in mind, and by restricting her to 60 miles offshore, so we didn't have to deal with any damage stability requirements, we were able to push through most of the keep as many of the traditional aspects that we could. I should stress that, however, that the refit has been designed to meet the larger yacht code wherever possible, particularly in areas of engineering, structural fire protection, and life-saving. So, weight. As seen earlier, Shamrock V is considerably heavier, some 34 tons heavier than originally, which has led to a new waterline being drawn approximately 400 millimetres above the original one. And this is now considered to be her design waterline. In fact, she also carries a considerable amount of aft trim brought about by when the lead was repositioned into the steel keel back in the 2000 refit. We considered reducing this aft trim. However, before doing so, we had to check if it was going to affect the performance, because the boss was not going to allow us to do anything that would slow her down. We did this using computational fluid dynamics again, and the outcome of the tests were interesting. It showed that she would be, off the wind, she would be faster with corrected trim. However, upwind, by correcting the trim, we would have to move the ballast forwards, which, due to the angle of the bottom of her keel, would have the effect of raising the ballast and reducing the righting moment. Shamrock is already the smallest and lightest of the J's, and any reduction in righting moment basically would mean she'd have to reef before the other J's was obviously going to be detrimental. So it was decided to leave that ballast where it was. As we reach the end of the project, it has become clear that we've not managed to reduce the weight very much at all. There's been some redundancy in the hydraulic system we've removed, and the battery bank powering that hydraulic system has been updated and streamlined. The electrical system and wiring has been updated, and a considerable amount of lead sheeting used for sound insulation around the engine room has been reduced. The stainless steel rudder that I mentioned earlier on, we've replaced the lower part of that, some 70% of its volume, with timber. Yeah, who'd have thought it? A wooden rudder might be better. We've saved nearly 300 kilos by going back to a wooden rudder, which gave me particular pleasure. And yes, we've removed some weight from the marble bathrooms as well by going to a honeycomb core marble. There's a picture of the new part of the rudder. The grey part in the photo there is now timber, and we left the top part as it was because of all the mechanism that was connected to it. Shamrock V's hull structure is a traditional composite hull structure employed quite regularly between the late 1800s and the 1930s on yachts. And a structure that's was largely unchanged over that time. In these pictures, we see other boats that we've been involved with, Cariad as old as 1896, and Mariquita in 1911, and Shamrock V in 1930. As you can see, it really is the same structure. And actually, if you go and visit the Cutty Sark in London, there's something familiar about that as well. As mentioned earlier, in Shamrock's case, the lower part of her hull has been plated in with an awful lot of steelwork now, which has given us an awful lot of longitudinal strength, and a fair amount of reinforcement has also been added to the deck. So it was decided that apart from, we added 2 extra pair of hull diagonals, but at the bow and the stern, and we removed a couple of big deck hatches in the aft deck. But that basically, if we restored the steelwork back to its original, back to full strength and thickness, that this would go a long way to strengthening her to the required levels. And in fact, I've absolutely no doubt that she's stronger now. She's in better structural shape now than she's been in 50 years, and almost certainly stronger than ever. With the accommodation, we discussed a number of changes, but mainly for reasons of schedule. Most were put aside. We have redesigned and replaced the saloon. Fitted 20 years ago. We have a new saloon now, more to the new owner's personal taste, and there's been one or two other modifications. However, the rest of the interior has been restored, refinished, and refitted in its current form. This is just some of the new joinery being built for the saloon, and which is now hopefully in the varnish shop. On the engineering side, the engineering has been led by the yacht's chief engineer, Jack McNally, and 5 or 6 other engineers. And the electrics and the hydraulic installations have been subcontracted to local companies under our and Jack's supervision. The overall engineering of the arrangement has also remained mostly unchanged. However, the process of removing, servicing, and refitting everything has allowed us to fit all clean, fresh insulation, replace piping and wiring, and any worn-out pumps and other systems. However, there have been 1 or 2 notable modifications. We've fitted a retractable bow thruster, entirely within the steel-plated part of the hull, so as to not disturb any planking. She's been completely rewired. She's been completely replumbed. All the batteries have been changed for more modern, lightweight lithium-ion batteries. The shafts and stern gear have all been removed and refurbished. The engines have been completely rebuilt, rather than replaced, which potentially would have been cheaper, however, to minimize extra structural and engineering works required to fit new ones. We've got smaller, lighter generators, and she's got an autopilot for the first time. We've got load sensors on all the rigging, and the bow fitting for the forestay has been redesigned to take a load-sharing system for the jib to try and reduce headstay sag without increasing rig loads. And the fire safety of the yacht has been brought up to current regulations. So, I have a quick run through before we completely run out of time. What have we been doing for approximately 60,000 hours in the last 2 years? Well, as described earlier, the hull was stripped of interior, engineering systems, and planking. The steelwork repairs were carried out after a full thickness survey, including extra diagonals, an aperture for the bow thruster, and maintaining as much original or otherwise steelwork as possible. The entire steel skeleton was shot blasted and painted. The hull planking was repaired. All edges were repaired to ensure tight caulking seams, and the top 4 strakes were joined together into longer lengths to give us a little bit more stiffness in the longitudinal direction. All these planks, bar 1, were the same ones fitted in 1970 at Campers. The deck edge and bulwark areas were repaired and replaced. We'll skip that bit. All deck fittings were removed, NDT'd, and refurbished and replaced as necessary. Running backstay pad eyes were upgraded due to distortion, and a new stem was built, laminated from Iroko, to replace the heavily degraded woodwork of what was the original one still in place. The stem bolts and counterbolts were all replaced in bronze, and all the planking was refastened using 6,500 new nickel aluminium bronze custom cold forged bolts, complete with isolating washers where they go through the steel. The hull was caulked and splined. The hull below the waterline was then resheathed in GRP for protection, and the whole lot was faired and painted, mostly using 2-pack paint, apart from the last gloss on the top sides, which will be brushed in single-pack paint for that perfect look, before the cove line and carvings are gilded. There are new covering boards and bulwarks, and the capping rail have been refitted. There's new forestay and backstay chain plates. We installed the bow thruster and the new rudder. And whilst this was going on, we reinstalled all the engineering. We restored and refinished the interior, and we built and installed the new saloon. The mast and boom were repaired and repainted, and the high-load rig fittings were tested and replaced as necessary. There still is an awful lot of painting and varnishing to be done. So the current proposed launch date for Shamrock V is now May the 9th this year, which is not far away, on a high spring tide, after which she's going to lie alongside for a few weeks in Southampton until we've got all the engineering systems commissioned. She'll then move downriver, away from the yard and under the Itchen Bridge, out to the open sea. That's a crucial move as the mast height is somewhat higher than the bridge. Once the rig is installed, we'll carry out an inclining test, partly for the rating and partly for the stability booklet and the MCA and ABS registration. And from here, she'll conduct sea trials and some crew training in the Solent under her new captain, Jason Beacon, before heading south to the Med, where some 94 years after she first competed for the America's Cup, she will still be racing competitively with the other J's, thanks to this ongoing program of repair and development that she's undergone over the last umpteen years, and which we've been honoured to be part of. Thank you.